APEC was a club or a meeting of leaders, of politicians, and business people. And it said that no other groups were part of the whole, the gathering that was here. And I was kind of offended because you here are part of APEC, okay? And I just wanted to, and they were talking about how there were labor unions, workers, underrepresented communities were not part of this. And in fact, you all are here. So let me tell you what the charge that we have is. The charge is to create, okay? We have a huge opportunity to do something that has not been done before, right? And I want to compliment the folks of APEC because the leaders back, 30 years ago, as you heard, created the whole notion of free trade of investment in the region. And it had a huge impact in terms of economic growth. And so what they have recognized, and I think part of it is because of how the times have changed, is that the pie has gotten bigger, now we have to figure out how to divide it up more fairly. I think that's what we're here to do, okay? So when I think about the new world and the context in which we're all working in, there are 4 things that I wrote down that come to mind, okay? The first one that I think about, as I jotted it down, was it's a new world, right? The amount of uncertainty we have has just zoomed up. We feel uncertainty all the time. The other thing is, what has worked before is not going to work in the future. I'm pretty sure of that. We have to find new ways of doing things, and this all boils down to business, no longer business as usual. That is what our charge is here. And so as we thought about how the economy and the growth from APEC, from its, Jakarta meeting, Bogor Declaration, free trade investment by 2020, which has passed, right? When we did that, it was like almost 30 years ago. Great economic growth, but what has happened is that with that economic growth, there were externalities, and we've had one of the issues that we're going to be talking about today as the focus is climate change and the impact. And the impact of climate change about how the extremes that we're experiencing are being borne by those who are underrepresented and generally in the areas in which there's the most damage and destruction. That is what the front end is. And finally, our leaders and our politicians and our businessmen and others have decided, and women, have decided that we need to work on going from a high carbon economic platform to a low carbon or no carbon economic platform. But when we do that transition, on the other end, who's going to bear the burden more than others? It will probably be the underrepresented, the people who are not here at the table. So as I jotted down what it is that we want to do here is that you're all here because APEC has said, and all of our leaders have said, they need your ideas. As the world moves on to this transition, the rules that are being written now cannot be disproportionately burdened by the underserved and underrepresented communities of the APEC member economies. We need diversity more than anything else. And having been in Silicon Valley, I believe, and worked in Silicon Valley, diversity is where innovation comes. So we have here, and Harizal will talk about this, roughly 140 leaders from all walks of life, sustainable businesses, civil society organizations, indigenous groups, youth, labor, women's groups from all around APEC. You are that diversity, you are the source of those ideas. And as I think about this, you are the bridge from here where we sit and where the leaders are going to be, who have the power, who have had the power. You're the bridge to those who traditionally have not had a voice and a seat at the table. All of you have those connections. You can connect the leaders of the APEC member economies to those who are not often seen or heard, but must be. Okay? So as I start about this, I think this is not only an economic imperative, it's a moral imperative. So at that point, with those opening remarks and setting the stage, let's start. So Harazal, okay? As we talk about the APEC Multistakeholder Forum, why don't you tell us, give us a snapshot who the delegates are and why we chose them.
So thanks, Philip. I think in terms of numbers, you've mentioned it, right? We have 140 plus delegates coming from more than half of APEC economies. From all over the world, all walks of life. We have people who are specialists, researchers, activists, so on and so forth in this room. Now, I think that's just on the outside. But what's really interesting to me is that this gathering of people are really a group of people that I think have made real sort of like initiatives and impacts in their own communities wherever they're coming from, be it at the policy level, be it at the community level, or be it at the not-for-profit or other sort of like organizational or connecting level. That is actually extremely powerful, because if you put 140 people who have actually done stuff on the ground, practitioners, who have actually seen what can work and what cannot work, and get them to work together to come up with ideas and send these messages to the leadership back in their own country or even at the APEC level, I think that is going to be extremely meaningful in where we are trying to find this way of how to move forward, how to do things better. Because you rightly mentioned, Philip, what has worked might not work. You're pretty sure about it. It will not work in the future. So we need to find those answers. So to me, the short answer to that question is that we have more than 140 agents of change in this room. And that is actually a powerful moment, and I hope in the next 2 days we all can put ourselves together, think together, and form something extremely strong, connected, and are able to operationalize this so that we can bring these messages, at a higher level.
So by the way, this is Harazal Hazri, who's the program director for the APEC Multistakeholder Forum. I know that you've seen all the bios we have this, so I want to get to the questions and we'll introduce folks as we go. So second question for you really quickly. We've heard a lot about just transitions. Okay. Do you feel like it's in fact a growing movement for just transitions? And how does it, from your perspective, how does it affect government from a public policy perspective?
So I think this is a really important and in fact a very interesting question, right? Because just transitions, it can mean different things to different people. It can mean, basically the way you articulate it in Malaysia, from where I come from, and probably in the United States of America, the Bay Area, probably really bring a different kind of idea and sets of sort of like, activities where you think, a just transition objective can be achieved. Now, I come from sort of like a higher middle income country. I have experience growing up in Malaysia, where Malaysia was a really struggling low middle income country. We have a set of leaders in Malaysia who were very proud to sort of like push the nation forward in terms of bringing up our GDP per capita. And to a certain extent, it has been met. But, coming from a country like Malaysia, I realized that development aspirations also come with a lot of costs, right? So when you talk about extremely sort of like disciplined Asian style of development approaches, like Malaysia, and possibly some other countries in the region share the same sort of like technique. When you talk about just, what does that really mean? Because is it at a community level? Is it at an individual level? Or is it this big sort of like vision that the country has for everyone? And by achieving that vision, inevitably, some pockets of societies might just basically fall within the cracks. Is that acceptable? I don't think so, but what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about just transition, I think the context, and we will try and put this context, because when we talk about APEC, right, we have diverse different economies in APEC. We have the higher income economies, we have the middle high income, the middle economies in APEC, and different development aspirations. So to put all of this into context, I really am looking forward for the next 2 days, because we represent many of these economies and we can talk about it. But really, can it be achieved? I think yes, in different ways. I don't think there's one single format to push for just transitions, but I think it can be achieved. It's just that we really have to put it in context of where we come from, which communities are affected, and how do we bring that to justice.
Thank you. So one of the things that we are doing here for all of you, all of our delegates, we're trying to create some guideposts for you in the conversations that are going to happen later on. And so this is why we thought this panel was particularly important, because these are the people who helped us put all of this together. So next we have Atari Lestari, who's at the Indonesian Just Energy Partnership, Just Transition. She's Associate Researcher at the Dala Institute for Environment and Society. So Tari, you just heard what Harizal just talked about. In your mind, and for all of us here, as we think about what this is going to look like in the conversation we have later on, what is the most interesting development of the just transition that you've observed in your research and talking with folks?
Yeah, so the concept of just transition was first invented or coined by labor union here in North America. And since then, the research and the development is mostly in the developed countries. And there are not so many things, there are not so many development in the developing countries, not until very recently. So when I did my research in just transition issues back in 3-4 years ago, I'm from Indonesia, and so I'm going to use the example of Indonesia. So Indonesia signed a Silesia Declaration on Just Transition back in 2018, but then when I talked to most stakeholders and some of them policymakers, they just don't know what is just transition. And then what are the implications if we don't understand the concept is that there will be a risk of inaction, or if there is an action, maybe we just don't understand the essence of what we actually need to do. So there is a possibility that we actually do something, but we actually continue doing what we do like in the past, but we just put a different label. So it's kind of missing the whole intention of just transition, which is leaving no one behind, or to put human in the center of a transition. So if we don't really understand the concept of just transition, it's just mean we should not put the word just, we should just put the name transition in different sector, like energy transition or maybe agricultural transition. And the interesting part right now is that most of the developing countries, especially for the past 2 years, for example, Indonesia or Vietnam or South Africa, has signed into this partnership called Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP. And that's kind of interesting because it's kind of put an angle of what just means and from who. So if we talk about justice, the scholars argue there are so many perspectives and elements on how we assess justice. And part of it is the justice between countries, and this is related to international climate negotiation. So if we talk about developing countries and global north and global south, and then the discussion is, if we want to do just transition, how the developing countries get support, because they always claim that we're not really, in terms of carbon emission, developing countries are normally per capita, they don't really pollute that much. So how this concept of justice between global north and global south are being kind of tackled into this kind of partnership. And then there's another question also about new type of colonialization. So most of the voices in developing countries talk about, yes, we want to do this transition, but we don't want to be colonized economically and also technologically, because if you talk about development of renewable energy, it's mostly concentrated in the developed countries. And if we talk about also the material, the critical materials or raw materials are normally produced in the developing countries. So there are so many different angles on how we evaluate just transition. And I think the angle of developing countries, I think, is one of the most important things these days.
So just really quickly for Indonesia, do you feel like when you first started this conversation about just transition, do you feel like now they're starting to get it a little bit better?
I think, yeah. So with the JETP, I think like a lot of different stakeholders right now started to want to understand what are just transition, what are the concepts, because if we don't understand the concept, how can we kind of formulate a policy? How can we formulate a program? So I think that right now we have JETP, we have a lot of different assistants and also different assistants from multilateral development banks, donors, and also like G7 countries. So the assistance is not only from financial perspective, but also for the capacity building to kind of get everybody have some kind of basic understanding of the elements and the principle of just transition to be able to plan it better.
Okay, great. So that seems to be an open question, perhaps among some of you. Okay, Ricky Managaran-Ranji, who is the founding board member of the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement, IPETCA, from New Zealand. Welcome. So, Indigenous communities have experienced historical injustices from economic development and sometimes also from climate mitigation adaptation actions. What do you think is imperative to ensure that a just transition will really have a positive impact on Indigenous communities?
I think the first thing we need to do is just acknowledge, because I'm in that capacity of representing our Indigenous peoples, acknowledge the First Nations people here.
Yeah.
Tangata Whenua, Mana Whenua, so the people in this local Bay Area, acknowledge them. And also acknowledge my colleagues over here, Yaku Omahi, tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa, and as well as yourself there, Philip, tēnei te mihi kia koe, e te rangatira o tēnei kaupapa. Thank you. It's an interesting question, and we have a fantastic delegation up from New Zealand. We've got a fantastic delegation from within the 21 economies as well. I feel like you could ask a lot of our delegation that same question and probably get quite a different perspective. There are people in our delegation that will just dwarf any knowledge I have in that space. So I might get a slap on the ears later on, but I'm just going to try and do the best I can.
Best you can.
To bring it up at a high level. I think from an Indigenous perspective, at least from Aotearoa New Zealand, we have it's not a perfect relationship with our government, but we have a long relationship with our government. And I think that has meant that we've been able to put in place some systems and some models in terms of how we negotiate or how that partnership actually works over the last 180 years, I think it is. Yeah, since we've had a treaty in place, the Tiriti o Waitangi. So that straight away gives you a different perspective from Indigenous peoples in terms of one of the more significant relationships that you all have, which is with your government. I think that plays an important part in terms of that transition, because we do tend to have quite a significant consultation process back down in Aotearoa New Zealand. So that might mean that when there is any natural land resource use, there's a process that people have to go through. We call it a resource consent process, which some will argue that it's not robust enough, but some will argue that it's light years ahead of some of the other economies potentially, where you actually have that conversation between the two parties to that treaty, i.e. our Māori people, our Indigenous people, and the government, and trying to find a middle ground which works for everybody. when you're talking about land, there's quite a lot of impact. Obviously, we've heard a little bit about it, not only in terms of a couple of our panelists here, but earlier in the day. The impact on land can be quite significant. And with our people, our Māori people, and for those that will be here for the coming days, we get to understand a little bit more that we have quite a significant relationship with our whenua and our land and our sky, and we refer to it as Ranginui and Papatuanuku as our Mother Earth. So we have a very different relationship with things in other parts of the world. So from a transition perspective, those are things that need to be taken into consideration. So it's not as straightforward as hey, look, we want to do something here, let's just do it. It's quite a process to go through, and so they have to be respectful of our tangata whenua, our people of the land back in New Zealand, Aotearoa, in terms of that relationship.
So could you give me an example? Something that, what you're saying, it seems to be there has to be a different mindset. I mean, classically, right? There's, in government, people look at certain things in a very binary way. It can be, has to be very concrete. You're talking something that is much more spiritual, and it's much more connection. So can you give an example of where an accommodation may have actually made things a lot easier for what people wanted to accomplish?
An accommodation?
Well, just maybe an agreement. It's something that was really difficult to make a decision, but because there was a concession made, because there was something that people suddenly got in the government that was able to break through.
Talking about any sort of specific example, as I say, there would be some people that would be well versed to. There'll be some people out here that over the course of the session that will be a bit more well versed to talk about those things. But it's more or less understanding that we do have that special relationship, that nothing's going to go without having that consultation with our First Nations people. I know that there is a similar, we spent some time, my colleague over here, we spent some time on the East Coast about a month and a half ago with the Pequot First Nation, and that was quite eye-opening in terms of understanding how different we are in that relationship, but also how similar we are in terms of the journey that we've had. So their relationship in terms of the land, and obviously that being one of the most significant pieces, it would have been fantastic to have Secretary Harlan here, but, and she would have talked about some of those interior issues in relation to oil and the like. We have stopped a lot of that down in Aotearoa, which would align with our indigenous people's thinking and intergenerational want to make sure that our whenua is actually looked after.
Okay, thank you. All right. Dr. Sarasa Kantara Tanaku.
You got it.
I got it. Okay. In other words, she told me to just call her Professor Mook. Okay? So, Professor Mook, thank you. I got it, right? In this forum, where we talk about you, and you have specifically talked about this issue of leaving no one behind in a just transition. You're from Thailand, and can you give us some examples in your mind what are success stories? And if you can, some stories that were perhaps not as successful, because I think we can learn as much from failures or non-successes as we can from successes. So,
well, definitely. Well, first I'd like to talk about a remote island in Thailand. It's called Jik Island, from the province of Chanthaburi. It's about 40 minutes boat ride from mainland, and it's about 110 hectares in area, with a population of 400, with 150 families on the island, and they had no access to electricity, right? So they used some like kerosene lantern at night. Those who have higher income will have a generator. Those who don't have enough income will not have access to electricity. And many times they have tried to contact the authority to say, well, we want electricity, can you help us? And the answer was always that you're too far away, too small community, it's too much investment. so they don't have access to electricity. So the community got together with one great leader who applied for a grant with the Ministry of Energy, the Energy Conservation Promotion Grant. They started in, let's say, more than 20 years ago, so they started the application like in 2001. Finally got approved 2003. The first phase of installment was 2004. They installed solar generator with lead acid battery. And the first phase was, the capacity was 7.5 kilowatt. And then 10 years later, they had the second phase, which they installed more solar to have the capacity of 40 kilowatt, right? And then the most current phase from like 2020 to 2022, they installed more to be 72 kilowatt, and they also changed all the battery from lead acid to lithium. And today, they are 100% renewable, including their fishing boats. Yeah, and they even go farther as a community to try to be a low carbon community of, they calculate their own carbon emission to make sure that there offsets everything if there's any fuel being burned. They don't allow any fuel vehicle on the island, with the exception of a few transportation, like rickshaw, I would say, to move things around the island. And they go even farther with like the innovation of like putting in a smart meter so that they can do like cater, like custom plan, like custom tariff plan for each family. Let's say if you are there on the island the whole time and you have high electricity costs, then you could pay like a monthly package. If you're not there all the time, you could do a prepaid plan, that if you're there on the island, you can add some money on the meter. And they go even farther, as in they can do a buy and sell of electricity among their own community. And they also have their own microfinance program of, they encourage everybody to save $1 per day, which is like 3 cents per day, so that they have the funding to repair their equipment and solar and everything else. So it's a very self-sufficient community, and they own and operate everything themselves. So like that would teach us to know that, like, first of all, everybody in this, like all the speakers, including you, right, said that the underdeserved or the communities are the one who are most affected, right, by the climate impact. And also they don't have a voice at the table. But this case example also teaches us to know that we cannot underestimate the potential of the community to do this amazing transition. And all of this transition happened from one great leader, right? And throughout this conference, we hear so much more example of how underserved communities are able to achieve this amazing transition themselves.
Is there an example that comes to mind, a short one maybe, that it didn't work out as people expected, and then do you have a sense of why?
Didn't work out. I do have example for like circular economy. I would say not necessarily energy transition. For circular economy, when the policy is top down and we don't have participation from the bottom, right? It's not bottom up. Then obviously we don't know the challenges, we don't know the opportunity, we don't know the lay of the land. And once you order something to be practiced, it's often not going to work because you don't really know what's happening on the bottom. And oftentimes with circular economy, right now people are still think, well, it's recycling. But it's way beyond that, right? Circular economy, we're talking about resource efficiency, we're talking about switching to more sustainable resources, we're talking about resource circularity where we want to retain value of materials in the value chain for as long as possible. So I think for everyone to be on the same page about like what Tari said, right? You have to know what you're doing to be able to implement. And you have to have participation from all stakeholders to get their needs and their challenges and things into consideration before you draft a policy and being implemented to have things to be successful.
That's a great point. I think one of the things that my experience in government is that there's a lot of theory. And, there's a lot of theory, really. And it comes from the top down, and theory is great, right? It kind of gives you a framework, but really all that matters is what happens on the ground. If you're not talking to anybody, you're going to have problems, right? That's the one thing we definitely know.
Yes.
And that's why I think all of you are here, because of your connections to people on the ground who are actually going to be affected. So please keep that in mind. Okay, so this is actually particularly joyful for me, because I'd love to introduce to you Muhammad Ali. Okay, Muhammad, Mo, as we call him. I've known him, how long? About 2 or 3 years now? Okay. He's kind of my mini protege. We don't look alike, but anyway. So Mo, we went to the same undergrad, and for all of you who are younger, he's a perfect example of what I talk about developing relationships, developing hard relationships. Mo made an effort to get to know me, and I'm so glad that he did. And as a result, we've continued to have a relationship. And I continued and I recruited him to be at World Affairs sort of the representative of the up-and-coming generation and young professionals who are interested in foreign policy and he's just been a joy to work with. And he was at Google and doing, what was it, AI, right? Yeah, AI, okay. And contrary to my advice, he ended up going to law school. And he's at Columbia Law School, where I went to law school, right? And we brought him back here because he's been someone who has been dedicated to what it is that we're trying to build here. So Mo, I'm just so delighted that you're here, and just wanted to thank you for making the effort, coming all the way from New York. So I guess the question we were talking about, you should just go ahead, I'm skipping a little bit here, but so for you, the whole thing of intergenerational justice is really, really important, and you're here. So tell me why that is so important. Why should we care about that?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining us today. Over 60% of the world's young people live in the Asia-Pacific region, experiencing a 6-fold increase in climate-related disasters from their forebears. And youth all over the world are energized to think about climate matters because we are experiencing the ravages of climate change, and we're going to continue to experience the ravages of climate change until we do something about it, and until we do something about it in an equitable way. So the intergenerational cohort that we brought around here are a number of people who have a tremendous degree of hope. Hope in working on the ground to make things happen, to create a sustainable economy that will persist for the years to come. We have Fulbright scholars in our cohort, we have company and nonprofit founders, we have investors, youth ambassadors, software engineers and students, activists between healthcare, technology, law, and everything in between. And, we bring a fresh perspective to the issue of sustainability and just transition. A fresh perspective born from having grown up in the digital age. The digital products that are going to be instrumental in designing and defining a world that will survive the future. And so we, young professionals, emerging leaders, intergenerational justice coalition, whatever you want to call us, we're the foot soldiers of climate change, the vanguard, if you will. The discussions that we're having here today are going to have to be engineered by someone, are going to have to be built by someone, are going to have to be tilled into the soil by someone, and are going to have to be maintained by someone for the decades and centuries to come. And we, soldiers, are going to be charting the course by stars we've never seen and digging with a divining rod for springs we may never reach. But by soldiering on and passing the baton, we can secure the blessings of a more just and more verdant world, not only for ourselves, but for our progeny. And so, we came here to talk about the brass tacks, to talk about the methane leaks from pipelines all over the country, to talk about the ravages of natural gas flaring, to talk about the agriculture industry and how mechanized commercial agriculture is a huge contributor to climate change, to talk about how we can address sustainability matters without displacing the workers, young and old, who form the foundations of our economy. And so, we're going to be here, and I encourage every one of you to interact with the Intergenerational Justice Coalition. They are a wonderful wellspring of skills and talent and ability. And we've done so much with so little, and all we ask is a seat at the table. And here we are, taking our seat, and hoping to keep it.
See you at the stage. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to throw it open, and I wanted this to be conversational. I mean, if I do my job right, I don't have to say anything, okay? So I'll throw this out to all of you. Harold, maybe you want to start. How do you think a just transition initiative could really bring intended positive impacts to the community?
I think we can look at it from different sort of like layers, but I'd like to start from the policy layer first. And I'll try and give an example so that it's probably easier for us to consume. So when we talk about just energy transition, I come from a country that is heavily invested in the oil and gas industry, right? So Malaysia has one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world. It contributes a lot to the government coffers. And it will want to continue, right, to develop technologies that will propel its business in the future. So that's on one hand. On the other hand is that with this understanding of oil and gas being this biggest sort of like propeller of energy, and energy is really the driver of development and growth. We can't discount that, right? Without energy, economies cannot grow. Okay, now with that context, try and think about this. Now we have this transition from, let's say, just look at one industry, which is essentially the automotive industry, right? So we used to have the internal combustion engines. It uses petrol, gas, you call it gasoline in the US. And now you have battery-powered, electricity-powered cars. You need to produce the batteries, right? The batteries are not just gonna come out and you can't pluck it from a tree, right? And all those components in the batteries needs to be created. There are two big things here. Number one is the technology itself. Who owns that technology? Who can produce that battery? Number one is really the materials that builds the battery, right? And one of the most important component in making batteries are raw earth, right? So you have to mine raw earth. So my country has some raw earth, right? So it's great that we're transitioning, it's great that we're building batteries because, then the carbon emission and everything is lower. But if my country does not have good policies to manage the mining of raw earth, how is that going to be positive for the people in my country as well as for economic development in my country? Right? You have indigenous peoples who are affected by mining of raw earth. We have, communities that's being displaced. And we know it's a dirty business. Mining raw earth it has a high impact to the environment. Right? So what I'm trying to say here is that while we are very positive about this whole idea of transitioning, especially when you talk about energy, especially coming from a country like Malaysia, who understands very well that energy equates to oil and gas. Now we want to transition that. We understand its impact in terms of carbon emission and all that stuff. But when you want to transition, you need new technology, which we don't own in Malaysia. We don't really understand. Quite frankly, we are still scrambling of what that new technology is. And then you need new materials to develop, batteries or whatever that will basically be part of this new technology. But by doing that, we must ensure that countries have good policies to manage this whole process. Because if not, then you would have, right, technology giants, manufacturers that will come to less developed economies with less stringent policies so that they can mine resources at a cheaper rate in the name of transition. How is that going to be just to local communities? So on one hand, we're talking about job opportunities and whatever, but I would also like to touch about policies that, might not be fair to the environment. While we think transition of energy is great, we need to have the policies in place to make it just, not just for our workers, but also for the environment for most generation.
Okay.
Because we've messed it up. We have to make sure that it's right for them.
Okay. Tari, any reactions from you? Anything that you see that, intended positive impacts of the community for doing it this way? Or maybe another question for you to react to and everyone else is, what do you expect out of the conference today? I mean, the next 3 days, is there something that you would like to see? And I'll ask everybody else to give that. Ricky, it looks like he wants to.
Yeah, I'm happy to start that.
Yeah.
I think the fact that there's, as you touched on, there's so many different walks of life, I think was the phrase that you used earlier, or John used earlier in the room. And the other thing that you mentioned, and I did actually have this conversation, it's a room full of practitioners, as opposed to, there'll be some policy people in here, but generally when you're in the space, there's a significant portion of policy people. So the fact that we've got a lot of these practitioners with very, very deep relationships in all parts of that ecosystem which surrounds the just energy transition, I think that what I would hope that we get out of this is the ability to look at things a little bit more holistically. We have this tendency to be in a particular lane, and we affiliate with the people in that lane, so we get better and better and better at specialising in that space. But here, you might meet someone from Silicon Valley in a very different space to what you may be in. You may be somebody that's building a solar farm, coming together and actually having that real good conversation about how you can complement each other. I think that's going to be the fun part, and those relationships that you'll end up having beyond this session today. And I wanted to just emphasise that and when I started talking, that for us it's very important. Everything you'll hear about is relationships, and I didn't want to talk about any particular example because there's a cohort of people there that at lunchtime you can approach them and they'll be far more versed to talk about those examples in greater detail from their own personal perspective. I just wanted to highlight the fact that at a high level, from an indigenous perspective, it's all about relationships, and it's all about looking at things intergenerational, and also looking at things through a holistic lens. I think those are the three things that I'm hoping that people will take away from my part in this conversation at least.
Okay, Tari, what about you? What do you want or hoping out of this particular?
I think it's related to my comments before about the development of just transition in developing countries. They're kind of a little bit different in terms of the political structure, social protection, labor policy, and also the structure of economy, in which most of developing countries have a large portion of informal economy. So APEC economies encompasses many different countries. Some are developed, some others are developing. So I think this is a good opportunity that people can meet together and kind of share experiences, and maybe to kind of think what kind of collaboration that can be done moving forward in Asia, in APEC economies.
Okay.
Well, for me, first of all, in content-wise, I'm looking forward to hear a lot of case studies that we're going to hear in the event here, and especially the content that are beyond energy transition. Because we were talking about climate change, right? There's many causes that could cause climate change other than energy. Improper land use could, release nitrous oxide. certain agriculture, livestock can release methane, poaching, refrigeration can release fluorinated gas, and all of which would translate to like very potent, carbon equivalent emissions. So I'm looking to see what are the other things that we could do to translate to just transition and then the decarbonization as well. And in terms of like outcome of long-term outcome of this forum, first of all, I hope that this is going to be the first of the many years that we're going to do.
Amen.
Yeah, and we have such a great pack here, and I hope that everybody can stay connected in certain platforms, certain channel, and find ways to collaborate with each other and like multiply the impact that we are going to transition into a better future. And hopefully we can also connect with the delegate for the second year and the third year and the next and so on, so that we as a citizen of APEC can work together towards a sustainable future.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, what about you? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, so many of us have lost quite a bit of faith in the institutions that be to respond to climate change in a just way. And as a result, especially among younger people, you see disillusionment with government and with policymakers, primarily due to petrified and weak responses to the climate crisis. And that has led to a situation where many of our fantastic delegates here have done phenomenal things on their own and have been building projects since, for many years have had a huge amount of impact by themselves and without the support of their governments, without the support of their policymakers and so forth. And so coming here, there's an opportunity for us to engage with and learn from people who have been working on and thinking about these matters for many years and, much longer than we have, that's for sure. And in so doing, accomplishing one thing that a great intergenerational delegate, Brandon, said to me, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is go down each one. You have about 2 minutes each. Okay. What are the 2 takeaways? If you could say for all that we've been here, if no one remembers anything else, but they will, I'm sure they will. I hope so. But for you, what are the 2 things that you want people to take away from this conversation here? Let's start. Let's go down here. So, Ricky, go.
I feel like I've probably touched on those, and
Okay.
I'm at risk of sounding like a broken record.
We have to repeat things here. That's
Yeah,
okay.
to really ingrain it. I get what you're saying. So, again, I very much invite you to talk to a very talented delegation up from Aotearoa, and they're all in this corner here. When we go to lunch, which is after this, you'll hear some very specific examples. I didn't want to talk about examples. I was involved in selecting people, and I understand their background, but it's not for me to talk about some of those examples. It's for you to go and talk to them in depth if you're interested in them. So leverage the opportunity from a relationship perspective, but then also understand how, when you have those conversations with our delegation, understand how we have quite a different mindset perhaps to other parts of other economies, rather in terms of the relationship that we have with our land, with our sky, and a few other aspects. And I've been quite deliberate not to talk about just transition, so to speak, because everything stems from that.
Right.
If you get that right, the just transition piece is a lot easier.
Okay, good. Thank you. Right. Move.
Well, for me, I think the key takeaway would be we should not underestimate the power of participation as well as collaboration to get something done. And I believe that there's no effort that is too little, and there's no community that is too small. Collectively, if we work together, we can move the earth.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Right, so number 1 is that I hope, after this conversation, after 2 days, the next 2 days, we can sort of like form somewhat of a continuous engagement between us, people of or from the APEC community, and exchange ideas as well as initiatives that is happening on the ground. You know, it's amazing sometimes. There's a lot of interesting and impactful initiatives that's happening all around this APEC economies, right? But we don't know about it. There's interesting stuff that's happening in Thailand and in Indonesia, I'm learning every day, and this sort of like forum brings all these initiatives together, and I hope that we can continue to try and see how we can use these initiatives in our country or our economy, and basically how we can also see whether if these initiatives would have the same or relevant impact to the communities in our economy. That's number one. Number two is really that whatever that we bring here, discuss here, I think we have to understand that it brings a very powerful voice, and we need to send it across to the policymakers back in our country. That is not easy, I know this, because I have had the experience working in the field. I've had the experience running a not-for-profit, and I have advised two prime ministers in my country. So I always feel like when I was out in the field, I said, why is it so difficult? Why is it that policymakers don't get this? This is not, it's really not that complicated. But when I'm at the Prime Minister's office, I realize that actually it is kind of complicated. So my point is that things are not as simple as it is, but we need to continue to push it up in whatever ways that we can, so that we have accountable leaders, and so that they can address all these issues that is actually impacting the communities, in our economy.
Okay, great. Tari?
Yeah, for me would be social dialogue, because it's one of the key elements of just transition, and the name of this event is Multistakeholder Forum. So I hope that in this forum everybody can speak, can voice their opinion. So it's like this interactive dialogue. We hope that it can kind of craft a way for the future cooperation, probably in the APEC region. And the second thing is, in some of the countries, when we talk about just transition, what comes first in mind is energy. So I also want to know here to explore that other sectors in transition. So we kind of also promote the concept of just transition in other sectors, and kind of get some examples from the countries that have done so.
Okay, thank you. Mo?
Yeah, I'm going to make my statement short and sweet. The first thing is, as far as the first half of just transition, I believe you said, Tari, that there are many theories of justice. You're totally right. As far as just transition is concerned, there's going to be labor justice, economic justice, racial justice.
Did you learn that in law school?
No, I learned it here, right?
Okay.
There are going to be many theories of justice, but no theory of justice is complete until we have taken into account the voices of all those concerned. And this is the true value of the multi-stakeholder forum and forums like these. And as far as the second half of just transition, which is my second point, as you said, Ricky, this community that we have here is very overrepresented with practitioners, with engineers, with builders, with founders, with investors. And I want to make sure, and I would like to see us all engaging not just on the platitudes, but on the brass tacks, on the examples, on the matters that we can really make an impact on now, because I know every one of you is doing something, and I know every other one of you can do something for one another. And so let's work together, build consensus, and apply our principles to the material circumstances that surround us.
Okay, thank you. So we are going to, I am right now the only person between you and lunch. So I have a lot of power. First, let's give great applause for our own.